Hello, and welcome to this training module on Morpheus Governance Core Concepts. In this module, we'll cover the key governance concepts in Morpheus, including groups, roles, users, identity integration, tenancy, and policies. In this first section, we'll provide an introduction to groups in Morpheus, including what they are and how to create them. So what is a Morpheus group? Well, consider it one of the fundamental building blocks of Morpheus governance and access controls. Whatever is placed within a group is exposed to users through Morpheus roles. Groups can contain clouds, hosts, VMs, networks, load balancers, resource pools, etc. We'll discuss tenancy a little later, but for now, understand that Morpheus groups are not multi-tenant. That is, they are assigned or tied to the specific tenant that they're creating in. Group access is defined by user roles. Every Morpheus user is given one or more roles, which provide access to a group or groups and the appropriate Morpheus resources. Morpheus policies can also be assigned to groups, allowing administrators to put in place guardrails or even enforce best practices on a group-by-group basis. Finally, a common best practice is to create a group such as all clouds, which would contain all integrated clouds, but is only available to those having an admin role. Similarly, there may be another group called app developers, providing access to one or more specific clouds based on needs. To create a group, select Groups under Infrastructure and then click Create. Configure the group name, optionally provide a unique code to be used with automation, and a location for the group. As a best practice, for simplicity, you might consider entering codes as lowercase strings and without spaces. Note that on Morpheus forms or pop-ups, required fields are designated by a vertical bar at the beginning of the field, as with the name field shown here. Those fields without a bar are optional. Once a group has been created, clicking its hyperlink takes you to the Group Details page. Here's the Details page for the All Clouds group just created. Near the top, note the tabs for some of the resource types that can be associated with the group. In this case, we're showing the Clouds tab, which is the default tab, but we also see Hosts, Virtual Machines, Bare Metal, Policies, and Wiki tabs. The table at center on the Clouds tab shows that there are no clouds currently associated with the group. We'll show you how to add a cloud in a different training module, but note that below the table, you can see a partial listing of supported cloud types, whether public or private, which could be added to the group. Note that the tabs shown do not represent all resources that could be exposed to a group. For example, with an integrated cloud, its VPCs or resource pools, networks, security groups, and other resources can be filtered to specific groups. So even if the same cloud has been exposed to multiple groups, administrators can granularly determine which of the cloud's resources are available to one group or another. We'll show this in the Clouds training module. Finally, note that most details pages include edit and delete buttons at upper right. So let's create a couple of groups. To do that, we go to Infrastructure, Groups, click Create, and in the pop-up, name our group. I'll call it All Clouds. Provide the code for the CLI or API, and again, the best practice is to eliminate spaces and use lowercase characters. Provide an optional location, and then click Save Changes. We now have our All Clouds group, and you can see it currently has no clouds, instances, hosts, VMs, etc. Let's go ahead and create a second group called App Developers. Again, give it a code and location, and click Save Changes. We now have two groups in the environment, and if we wanted to look at a group's details, we can click the hyperlink for one of the groups. I'll go ahead and click All Clouds, and here we can see the details page for the All Clouds group. Note the default Clouds tab, and in the center you can see that there are currently no clouds configured as part of this group. This completes a quick walkthrough of Morpheus groups. In this section, we'll describe Morpheus roles. Found at Administration Roles, roles are defined sets of Morpheus feature permissions and resource access. There are three default roles in the Morpheus environment: the System Admin role, the Tenant Admin role, and the User Admin role. These roles are owned by the system, and while they can be assigned to users, they cannot be edited. As a common best practice, use these roles as templates to create new roles that can then be edited by administrators. A role's feature permissions determine the level of access for Morpheus UI menus and features. For example, permissions for the administration submenus and parts therein can be set to none for a role that would be assigned to a developer or other non-administrative user. Roles also define resource access. The resources for which access can be determined include groups, clouds, instance types, blueprints, report types, personas, catalog items, VDI pools, and workflows and tasks. Two of the default roles, the System Admin role and the User Admin role, are referred to as user type roles, as they can be assigned to specific users and provide that user access to the permissions. The System Admin role has all feature permissions and resources in the environment fully enabled. The System Admin role is a super user, similar to a root user on Linux or the Windows administrator. The System Admin role is assigned to the admin user created when Morpheus is first installed. It's a best practice to create another role from this template and assign it to named administrative users who manage the environment. In doing so, you might also disable some features. The User Admin role comes pre-configured with a subset of permissions and access which might be assigned to an administrator for a subtenant or for other purposes within the master tenant. It is not as expansive as a System Admin role. And again, it should be used as a template to create new roles as needed. The Tenant Admin role is a special type of role known as a tenant role, which is not assigned to users. Instead, it's assigned to one or more subtenants and determines the maximum permissions and resource access for any user within the subtenant. We'll look at the concept of subtenants later in this module. The Tenant Admin role contains a subset of permissions as compared to the System Admin role, but also includes a Clouds resource permission in order to enable or disable subtenant access to specific clouds. Like the System and User Admin roles, the best practice is to copy from the Tenant Admin template and create new Tenant Admin roles that can be applied to subtenants. Once created, Tenant Admin roles can be applied to multiple subtenants. To create a role, go to Administration Roles and click Create Role. give the role a name and description, select the role type, tenant or user as just discussed, and optionally copy from another role. Copying from another role will result in the new role beginning with the same permissions and access as the copied role. Alternatively, not selecting a role to copy from creates a role with essentially no permissions or access, allowing the administrator to then enable only those permissions that are needed. The multi-tenant role and multi-tenant locked checkboxes are used for environments containing subtenants. We'll discuss those later in this module. Once Saved Changes is clicked, Morpheus will immediately present the Feature Permissions page in order to configure the role, whether using the Copy From role feature or not. Once a role has been created, the administrator is taken to the Role Permissions page, where they set up feature access permissions as well as access to key system resources. There are nearly 150 permissions that can be configured, encompassing administration, infrastructure, the library, operations, provisioning, tools, and more. Permissions are grouped by feature headings, which can be expanded or collapsed. Feature headings and their specific feature permissions have a drop-down for setting its level of access, including None for no permission, Read permission, which allows a user to view a feature, Full permission, for which the user has full access to create, edit, or delete, and other selections specific to the feature. Each permission includes a detailed description. Note that the Roles page in the Morpheus documentation provides additional information, including the available levels of access and common best practices. All of our attention on this slide has been the Features tab, but remember that there are up to 9 additional permissions tabs depending on the type of role being configured. Let's take a deeper look at those other permissions tabs. First, note that they're not all available to every role. For example, the Clouds tab is only available for the system admin role or roles copied from that role, as well as any roles copied from the tenant admin role or the tenant role type. This permission is what allows an administrator to add clouds to Morpheus, and optionally, this may be allowed from within a subtenant. The Groups tab is available when configuring any role with the user role type. It does not apply to roles with the tenant role type, because groups are limited to the tenant in which they're created. Groups cannot be shared from the master tenant or subtenants. Here's an example of the Groups tab, which provides a list of groups from which the role could be provided access. Shown here are the All Clouds and Developers groups. The Default Access selector provides a simple way to globally set the role's access level for every group. Use None to disable access to all groups, use Read to allow viewing of the groups, or use Full to enable access to all groups. Each group's access setting at Write is default when the role is created, in order to reflect the setting in the default access dropdown. However, administrators are able to change the access level by enabling or disabling access on a group-by-group basis. When new groups are created, they will inherit the default access setting. Note that this default access setting and access dropdown behavior is the same across the remaining permissions tabs. The Instance Types, Blueprints, Report Types, and Catalog Item Types tabs are similar in that they provide the ability to enable or disable role access to these resources. While the Instance Type tab, shown here, and Report Type tabs provide the out-of-the-box lists of those Morpheus resources, the Blueprints, Catalog Item Types, VDI pools, workflows, and tasks are blank until those resource types are created in the environment. The Personas tab is a special tab related to the 3 available personas that are part of the Morpheus environment. User persona settings control the available personas for a given role. The screenshots you've seen to this point involve the standard persona, which is a way of referring to the full Morpheus UI user experience. The service catalog and virtual desktop personas involve separate, unique user experiences. We'll cover the service catalog persona with a simple shopping cart user experience in a separate module. So now let's have a look at roles. And to do that, we go to the Administration menu and select Roles. And here we see the 3 default roles as a result of a Morpheus installation. The System Admin role, which is a super user role that has the capabilities of doing anything in the system. The Tenant Admin role, which is not a user role, but instead it's a tenant role, which means it's applied to a subtenant and represents the maximum permissions allowed for any user within that subtenant. And then finally, we have the default User Admin role, which is a subset of the System Admin role. It is intended for users, but it does not have the full permission set of the System Admin role. Note that also under the Owner column, all 3 of these roles are owned by the system, which means that these roles cannot be modified. But what we recommend as a best practice is to use these roles as templates as needed. So for example, you make a copy of one of these roles and determine whether you want to keep the new role with all of the same permissions, or perhaps configure a subset of permissions based on your needs. And then that new role can be assigned to a user, and further changes can be made if ever needed in the future. So let's go ahead and drop into one of these roles and look at the Permissions tabs. Note that we have these tabs of permissions which apply to various objects within the Morpheus environment. The first tab is for the features, and that simply equates to the user interface menus, submenus, and features. It's an alphabetical list of all UI features. This particular role that we're looking at, the User Admin role, is owned by the system, so we can't go over to the Access column and make any changes to the permissions. Now let's take a look at the other Permissions tabs. The Groups tab determines whether the role will have access to specific groups in the environment, and we can see that this default role has full access to all groups. Instance Types provides access to Morpheus instance types, whether those are the default instance types provided with Morpheus or any custom instance types that get created. Also, note that custom instance types, when created, are listed at the bottom of this list. And again, were this an editable role, the administrator could come in here and enable or disable access to each instance type. Once blueprints are built in the environment, they would be listed on the Blueprints tab, and the administrators could configure access as they would do for instance types. There are default report types that can be configured for access. So for example, you might want to disable certain cost reports for roles within a subtenant. The Personas tab is used to allow or disallow role access to the various Morpheus personas, whether that's the standard UI persona, the shopping cart-like service catalog persona, or the virtual desktop persona. Catalog item types are the self-service catalog items exposed through the service catalog persona. So once these are created, they are permissioned here, as you would do for instance types or blueprints. Finally, the Workflows and Tasks tabs allows an administrator to determine if any automation tasks or workflows are available for the role. Let's go back to roles, and what we'll do now is step through the process of creating a new role. And what we'll do is create a new role leveraging this user admin default or template role. So we click Create Role, and in the pop-up, we'll give the role the name Ops Admin, and then a description. For the type, there are two types of roles, user role and tenant role. User roles are roles intended to be assigned or associated to a user, whereas the tenant role is a special role applied to a subtenant and representing the maximum permissions allowed for any user within that subtenant. We want to leave the default user role type selected. And in the Copy From Role field, this is where we can select that default user admin role, such that this new role will start out with all of the permissions as the user admin role. Clicking Save Changes creates the new role and also brings us to the role's Permissions tabs, where as an administrator we could modify each tab's permissions as needed for this new role. On the Features tab, we see an alphabetical listing of all UI features, grouped by major functional areas. We can easily see the groupings by collapsing the view. For each feature, we could enable or disable access based on the drop-downs in the Access column. Note that the available access controls will vary based on the specific feature, with choices including None, Full, Read, User for those objects created by the user, etc. Similarly, with the list collapsed, we can set the access level for all features in the functional group. There is no Save button on the Permissions tabs. To save a change, simply leave the tab or page. We could also configure permissions on the other tabs. Most of the other tabs contain a default access feature, which allows me to set permissions for all permissions in the list, whether we want them all set to None, Read, or Full. Note that each permission has default as its access setting, so if there are specific permissions that we don't want to have follow the default setting, just select them and modify as needed. Each of the tabs work in this way. This concludes this demo, where we looked at roles, role permissions, and how to create a role. In this section, we'll show you users in Morpheus. Morpheus users can be found under Administration Users or Administration Tenants. Select a specific tenant and then Users. The former lists users in the master tenant, and the latter lists users in a specific subtenant. In either case, administrators can manually create or add users, as well as edit or delete users. When creating or editing users, one or more roles can be assigned. Users with multiple roles assigned will have the cumulative permissions and access as set for those specific roles. As you've seen, it's through a user's assigned role that they will have access to UI features, groups with clouds, instance types, as well as other resources. Users can be brought into Morpheus through many supported identity system integrations. For example, Active Directory, LDAP, SAML, and so on. To create a user, from the Users page, click Create Users. Required fields include the username, email, role, and credentials. To give the user a role, use the search field. Just start typing any part of a defined role's name in the search field, and then select from the resolved list of roles. At the bottom of the form, use the Linux and Windows settings fields to specify a user account to be created anytime this new Morpheus user provisions a Linux or Windows system. Users can be impersonated provided the user attempting the impersonation has the appropriate permissions. The appropriate feature permission is admin, tenant, impersonate users. Here we're looking at the users for a subtenant known as Pied Piper. To impersonate a user, click More for the selected user and then click Impersonate. This brings up the view of Morpheus from the user's perspective. Note that the Morpheus tabs or features shown at top are entirely dependent on the impersonated user's feature access permissions that we discussed previously. If the user should not have administration or provisioning access, just ensure that the user's role has those feature access permissions set to none. Note here that Morpheus tenants, whether master or subtenants, can be white labeled with custom logos, colors, and custom style sheets. This Pied Piper tenant has had its colors and logo changed. Finally, to stop impersonating a user, click the username at upper right and then select Quit Impersonating. Located at Administration, Users, User Groups. User groups are a logical grouping of users for provisioning purposes. Configuring and using a user group when provisioning will result in the group's user accounts automatically being created on the provisioned instance. Create a user group with the Create User Group button, and then provide a name, description, name of the group ID to assign members to in Linux. Optionally, check the sudo access checkbox to provide the group members with root access, and finally, select the desired users. Here, we've selected P. Barker and G. Blanston. To use the user group feature, open the User Config section on the configuration page of the provisioning wizard. If you haven't seen the provisioning wizard yet, don't worry. We'll cover it in depth in another training module. The Create Your User checkbox tells Morpheus to give the new instance the user account that you have specified in your user settings. You may recall that these are referred to as Linux settings and Windows settings on the new user form we discussed previously. To add a user group, select one in the User Group dropdown. Here's an example where the Create Your User checkbox was checked and a user group was selected when provisioning an instance. The resulting etc password file from the provisioned instance shows that the users in the developer admin user group, P. Barker and G. Blanston, were created, as was the user developer lin, which was configured as part of the provisioning user's Linux settings. In this demo, we're going to show you Morpheus users, show you how to create a Morpheus user, and also talk about and show you how to create a Morpheus user group. Now, users are found in the administration menu and users. Here we see this environment has 3 users currently. Just note that the last 2 users were created by me a few moments ago for purposes of this demo, for a step that we'll be doing in just a few moments. The only user that would be here by default is that admin user that's shown, which is a special user created at the time Morpheus is installed. And if you look over at right in the role column, you'll see that that admin user does in fact have the system admin role, whereas those other 2 users have been provided another role that I created called the developer role. So let's go ahead and create a user by clicking the Create User button. Give the user first and last name. Provide a username and email address, and of course these are required fields. Then we need to select the role. So if I start typing in the search field the name of a role, I can go ahead and select the ops admin role for this particular user. I then have to provide credentials. And then down at the bottom, I have the Linux settings and Windows settings areas. Now these are optional fields where we could identify a user or users to be automatically created on a provisioned instance, be that instance Linux or Windows based. I'm not going to fill this out currently. I'm just going to go ahead and click Save Changes. And now we can see our new user in the environment, and we can see the role that this user has been associated with. For the last step here, we're going to look at user groups. So if we go right up next to the Users tab, there's a Users Group tab, and we can click Create User Group to create a user group for the environment. And we'll just give that group a name. Provide a short, useful description. The server group field is for identifying a Linux ID number. We won't fill that out here, but we will go ahead and check the sudo checkbox for root access. And then in the users search field, we're going to begin typing the names of the users that we know about that we want to add to this user group, and obviously select them as well. Now with this user group created, this becomes an optional feature as part of the provisioning menu, such that when we provision an instance, we can select this user group and Morpheus will automatically create these user accounts on any instances that we provision. That's it for creating a new user group, other than coming down and clicking Save Changes. That completes this demo where we looked at users and how to create users and user groups in Morpheus. In this section, we'll show you the options for identity integration into Morpheus. There are a number of ready-to-go identity integrations included with Morpheus. Identity sources are located under Administration, Users, Identity Sources, or with subtenants, Administration, Tenants, choose the subtenant, and then Identity Sources. Integrations natively included or supported are Active Directory, LDAP, JumpCloud, Okta, OneLogin, SAML, Custom External, and Custom API. The identity integrations enable on-demand user account creation from the configured identity source user information. Configuration supports setting a default Morpheus role in the case of customer role mix-ups, setting a required distinguished name association, and specific mappings between the identity source's distinguished names and Morpheus roles. Note that the role mapping section at right will be populated based on the Morpheus roles created in the tenant. For additional information on integrating specific identity sources, refer to the Identity Management section in the Guides area of Morpheus documentation. In this section, we'll describe the multi-tenant capabilities in Morpheus. Morpheus supports the concept of multi-tenancy, where you can have completely isolated subtenants coexisting in the same Morpheus environment. Multi-tenancy is commonly used by managed service providers to provide separate Morpheus environments for their customers, but they can also be used by regular Morpheus customers to provide separate subtenants based on their own organizational elements. The master tenant is the default tenant created during the installation of Morpheus, and there can only be one master tenant. The system admin and other default system roles are part of the master tenant. Subtenants are completely isolated environments with unique groups, roles, users, and resources. Subtenants cannot share or see resources created in other subtenants. Administrators in the master tenant create subtenants, seed initial subtenant roles and users, and expose clouds and resources to subtenants. Master tenant administrators determine the scope of permissions for each subtenant, which, based on use case, may be limited or may include administrative roles with enough privileges to fully administer the subtenant. Lastly, each subtenant can be white-labeled for a custom look and feel unique to a customer's environment. There are multiple roles that are used in Morpheus at the master tenant and subtenant levels. Tenant roles set the maximum level of permissions for a subtenant. This role cannot be assigned to an actual user, but instead it sets the limit or guardrails for any user role or user created within the subtenant. This ensures that if a subtenant admin has the ability to create new roles, those roles are ultimately limited by the permissions set in the subtenant's tenant role. In the image here, you can see two subtenants, A and B, and that they each have a tenant role that provides a boundary around the other roles in the subtenant. With subtenant B, we're making the point here that a single tenant role can be applied across multiple subtenants, or each subtenant can have a unique tenant role. There are two types of user roles that can be created: multi-tenant user roles and single-tenant user roles. An important feature of a single-tenant user role is that they're limited to the tenant they are created in, whether that is the master tenant or a subtenant. In the image, we show a number of single-tenant roles that have been created in the subtenants as well as the master tenant. Multi-tenant user roles, when created, will be pushed to all existing subtenants as well as any new subtenants. Multi-tenant roles are created at the master tenant level by the admin, and they provide a convenient way to propagate appropriately permissioned roles for the subtenants. These roles can then be used as templates when creating users in the subtenant. Changes made to the multi-tenant role from the master tenant are automatically propagated down to the subtenants unless a subtenant has modified the multi-tenant role, which breaks the connection between the multi-tenant role and the subtenant. To prevent subtenants from modifying a multi-tenant role, the master tenant administrator can check the multi-tenant locked checkbox. In the image, you can see that the master tenant administrator has created a multi-tenant user role which has been propagated out to the two subtenants. Note that at least one multi-tenant user role must be created before any users can be created in any subtenants. To create a subtenant, the master tenant administrator would go to Administration, Tenants, and click Create Tenant. In the pop-up, give the tenant a name and description, an optional subdomain for direct subtenant user login, select a base role for the tenant, and set the appropriate currency for tenant pricing information. Note that the base role on this form is the same as the tenant role previously discussed. You must select a base role here, so as a practical matter, you should probably create an appropriate tenant role prior to creating the subtenant. Alternatively, you could select the default tenant admin role, but since that role is owned by the system and cannot be edited, you would not be able to make changes to the role going forward. Once a new subtenant is created, it'll be displayed on the tenants page. In this case, the new subtenant is known as ABC Beverage, and you can also see that we created a unique tenant role for it. Also, note that the default Morpheus tenant is denoted as the master account. In the Morpheus API and variables, you'll see tenants also referred to as accounts. Drilling down into the new tenant by clicking its hyperlink, we can see the available details. Normally, this is the page where an admin could add users to the subtenant. However, Morpheus environments must first have a multi-tenant user role created, which is propagated out to the subtenants. This environment does not have any multi-tenant user role created, so that's why the informational message is displayed at center. The administrator first needs to create a multi-tenant user role before users can be added. Note that in addition to the master tenant, each subtenant supports the integration of unique identity sources to control access to the subtenant and its resources. Here's an example of how one might create a multi-tenant user role for Morpheus subtenants. Roles are created at Administration Roles. The example shown here is for a subtenant admin role, which would be useful for environments where individual subtenants need to manage their own environments. The default user admin role template, one of 3 role templates made available upon initial Morpheus installation, is made for this purpose. Just copy from that role and modify it as needed for the new multi-tenant role. Also, be sure to select user role for the type, as that's what's needed in order to be able to create users in the subtenant. Note that additional lower permissioned multi-tenant user roles may be created based on needs. Finally, check the multi-tenant role checkbox, and optionally check the multi-tenant locked checkbox for reasons we discussed earlier. Note that non-locked multi-tenant roles will stay synced so long as they aren't edited. Once edited, they become a unique role but with an identical name, but they can be brought back in sync by locking them. Once a multi-tenant user role has been created, subtenants are able to add users. From the master tenant, the initial subtenant users can be created from Administration, Tenants, select the tenant, and create user. Here we can see that an admin user for the subtenant has been created. Subtenant roles can also be created here. At this point, a master tenant admin could continue adding new users and roles, or could pass over subtenant user management to the new subtenant admin. Here is the view when logged in as or when impersonating the subtenant's admin, John Smith. Remember that you can see the current username at upper right. Also, remember that the UI features available to this user are the result of the tenant role that applies to the subtenant, as well as the user role that was used when creating the user. These are not the full level of permissions as available for an administrator in the master tenant, but rather a subset that is entirely configurable based on the role. As an example, and this may not be apparent to you yet, but the administration menu available to an admin in the master tenant includes 8 features, while the admin for this subtenant only has 4. However, this admin now has the appropriate permissions to begin building out the subtenant, including creating and configuring groups, perhaps adding clouds based on the permissions provided, and adding new roles and users. Additionally, if the white labeling permission has been enabled for the tenant role and the user role, the subtenant admin could white label or customize the subtenant with a custom logo, colors, custom style sheets, and various other features. In this demo, we're going to look at Morpheus subtenants. We'll create a tenant role for a subtenant. We'll create a subtenant, and we'll also create a multi-tenant user role. Let's get started by going to Administration, Tenants. Note that by default, there's only one tenant listed, and that's the Morpheus tenant, which is also denoted as the master account. Tenants are also known as accounts in the Morpheus environment, particularly in the CLI or API. Before we can actually create a subtenant, we need to have a tenant role created. So for that, let's go back to the Administration menu and select Roles. To create a tenant role, what I'm going to do is make a copy of this tenant admin default role that was part of the Morpheus environment upon installation. So to create the role, click Create Role. I'll name it ABC Beverage Tenant Role and then give it a short description. Now for the type. Previous roles that we created were user roles, but this is going to be a tenant role, so I need to ensure I select tenant role. And then for the copy from role, I'm going to open this up and be sure to select that tenant admin template role and then click Save Changes. I'm not going to make any changes to the permissions as we've already shown you that. Instead, I'm going to go back to the roles display, and here we can see this new tenant role that's been created. And note that the type is tenant role type, and the owner is Morpheus and not the system, which means that this role can actually be modified if needed. So now that we have the tenant role, let's go ahead and create a subtenant. So we go back to Administration, Tenants, and then click Create Tenant. And in the form, provide a name and give a short description. And then in the subdomain field, I'm going to enter ABCBev. So the way this works, as you see in the description below, it provides a way or a path for a subtenant user to go to the Morpheus Appliance login page and provide their subdomain, and in this case that's ABCBev, followed by a slash, and then their own username, and be able to log in from that Morpheus Appliance login page. We also need to select what is called our base role. Now in reality, this is also known as the tenant role, so we'll select the tenant role that we just created, ABC Beverage Tenant Role. I won't modify the currency or advanced options, but if I go ahead and click Save Changes, we can see that that subtenant has now been created. There's currently no users in the subtenant, so if I click on the subtenant's hyperlink, this would be the way to add users to the subtenant. But when I do that, note that there's no Create User button. And instead, I have this informational display. No roles available. Please create a multi-tenant user role in order to be able to create users for this tenant. So this means that I need to back out of here and go back to roles and create a multi-tenant user role. For that, I go back to Administration, Roles. I click Create Role, and I'm going to name this multi-tenant user role Subtenant Admin Role. I'm purposefully leaving the name generic because if I have other subtenants in the environment, this role would of course cascade out and be available across all subtenants. I'll go ahead and give a description. For the type, I'll leave the user role selected since this will be a role that is associated with users. And then for the copy from role, I want this role to be a subtenant admin. And the most appropriate role to copy from would be this user admin role template, which is intended for subtenant admins. The last two things I need to do, because this is a multi-tenant user role, is I need to address these two checkboxes down below. First off, I have to check this one in order to in fact make it a multi-tenant user role. And then, in order to provide that security that we discussed, such that the multi-tenant user role could not be modified from within a subtenant, I can check this multi-tenant locked checkbox, which would prevent anyone, provided they have the permissions from within the subtenant, it would prevent them from branching off or making changes from this multi-tenant role. So with all of these selections made, I can go ahead and click Save Changes, and again, I'll just go back to the roles display, where we can see the multi-tenant role that I created, called Subtenant Admin Role. It is a user role, it's a multi-tenant role, and it's owned by Morpheus, so it can be modified. Now if I go back to the tenants display and click into my subtenant, note that I now have the Create User button. And as an administrator, I could click this Create User button, fill out the form, just as we've done previously to create specific users for this subtenant. This concludes the tenant demo, where we looked at how to create a tenant role, a subtenant, and a multi-tenant user role. In this last section, we'll cover Morpheus policies. Morpheus policies add governance, ease of use, cost savings, and auditing features to Morpheus environments. There are currently over 30 policies that can be configured, encompassing approvals, resource limits, budgeting, quotas, naming, etc. And the list of policies is constantly growing. For example, in Morpheus version 6, several new policies were added. Morpheus enables administrators to create policies scoped to users, roles, groups, clouds, tenants, plans, networks, and global scoping to give admins full control and governance over their environments. Policy generation is a role permission. Here we're going to create a simple policy, showing you just how easy it is to do. Policies can be created at Administration, Policies, Add Policy. First, select the policy type from the drop-down. In this case, we're creating a Max VMs policy, which will end up scoping to one of our Morpheus groups. Then, set a name and provide a description so you don't forget the reason for the policy. Then you'll need to actually configure the policy. In this case, there's only one configuration setting, representing the maximum number of VMs allowed. Note that this is a required field. Finally, you configure the filter or scope for the policy. We want this one to apply only to the QA group, so we set the scope to group, select the QA group, and then provide the name of the tenant for the group. This filter section is very powerful in that it allows an administrator to easily apply added governance exactly where it's needed. Lastly, click Save Changes. Once created, you'll see the policy definition displayed at Administration Policies. The display includes the policy type, name and description, the policy configuration, and the configured scope for the policy. As for this specific policy, it means that users in the QA group will get an error and will not be able to proceed when trying to provision VMs if there are already 30 VMs in the group. If there are conflicts such that it's impossible to apply multiple policies simultaneously, then the conflicts are resolved in the order as shown here: cloud, group, role, user, and then global. For example, an instance naming policy scoped to a cloud would take precedence over a naming policy scoped to a group associated with that cloud. Note that while a policy can be modified after it's created, For instance, it could be disabled, or the configuration could be modified, the scope for the policy cannot be modified. For that use case, just create a new policy. In this module, we covered the key governance concepts in Morpheus, including groups, roles, users, identity integration, tenancy, and policies. Thank you for completing this course.